Hi, everyone. So this is Geek Education Podcast. I'm your host, Paulius. Today, I have a huge pleasure welcoming on board Dr. Ray Griffin. He is a senior lecturer in organizational studies at SETU and a principal investigator in several large EU projects. Hi, Ray.
Hi, everything's lovely to join you.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you for joining us today. And I was explaining to the audience on social media. I had a couple of questions after I announced this on the newsletter as well. We will talk data today, but data is a very wide topic, and I constantly get the questions that are not particularly covered in the media or in discussion, especially employee well-being part, or high performing teams versus work and life balance, and how to make sure your organization does not sacrifice that sustainability and data driven aspect of it. So, but let's begin from the very beginning. I'm just interested about your professional journey. Share with us how it all began and what have you done over the time.
Okay, thanks, Mel, for this. It's lovely to join you. So, I've had a very long and winding road in my career, so we could take up a lot of the time today talking about that. But I suppose for the last 20 years or so, I've been working in SETU, which is based in Ireland, which is where I'm from. And so my normal beat is teaching MBA students and DBA students, and I have a bunch of PhD students and running large European projects, as you said. So most of my projects are about studying large, complex, messy organizations that are really hard, even cognitively, to put together and build a map of for yourself. So I've studied like ours. We did deep ethnographies of an Irish bank, of a charity, of a university. We studied an earthquake as an organization. We've studied board meetings. So a lot of ethnographic work up close with large, messy, complex organizing. That really influences my own teaching and my own research. So my own specialism, away from my teaching and my own PhD students, is on studying public services. And my last few projects have really been around digitization and transforming analog public services into data-driven digital ones. So I'm not sure that's
Fantastic.
a rich enough
Yeah,
explanation.
no, that's fabulous. So this is exactly what caught my ears, when we met first time, and I was listening to you, and normally data topics, they are quite dry, tend to be not that entertaining, tend to be very logical and numerous. But I like the aspect of the welfare and the public services you mentioned. Can you give us a few examples what you actually done in those areas, which will work as a great introduction, to our larger topic later?
Yeah, well, like some of the most complex organizations we have are things like our social welfare system in many European countries. So I've studied the Irish one for the last 12 years, doing a large ethnography. And it's really, the scale of it is immense because there's 7,000 people working in it. It makes 1 million payments a week. So it's bigger than any bank. It has an office in every village and town in our country. And it runs very complicated social programs that are always being adjusted through our law and our laws and our politics. So from that, my most recent study was working closely with the Slovenian government, and we were looking at how to digitize casework. So governments are spending a huge amount of money on supporting unemployed people, and they meet job counsellors in unemployment offices, and it's not altogether sure what they should be doing. And they don't
Yeah.
use any data really to inform those casework sessions. And of course, it's such a data rich environment. There's so much information about the labour market, where the jobs are, how long somebody will be unemployed, what the different options are. And really, these caseworking sessions, they kind of use a Californian self-help methodology of listening very carefully to the person and being encouraging and motivating them, but without any data. So we studied how to use all the carefully collected data analytics from public statistics offices and also the administrative data. And could we build some tools that would really support caseworkers and use data to change the world? And by that I mean, like, data can really, really reorientate a person from where they are to where they want to go. And it's a different type of change than being told to do something. People tend to understand why this is a good path with data, when they believe the data and when the data addresses their complex needs. So I'm very passionate about this concept called data storytelling, which is where data is an actor in a social situation. I think, like, almost everybody in Ireland at the moment is jogging, and the starting point for jogging is often the Couch to 5K website. And it kind of explains how does somebody who has never really jogged before, how do they start? And it gives them a little Excel spreadsheet of how much you should do. And of course, the problem with jogging is we all can run, but if we all ran, we'd injure ourselves. So the trick in that spreadsheet is to slow people down to make it sustainable. And so data is used there to really make people fitter, which is most people's kind of personal goals. But using this really smart intervention of data. And so that's kind of what I think about the work in the unemployment office. So we worked closely with the Slovenian government for 3 or 4 years. We visited their offices. We did a lot of ethnographic work with their case counsellors, with unemployed people, and really kind of understood the context and situation and developed this really cool tool which has this potential to really improve the outcomes of counselling and all this investment that the taxpayer is making in those services.
Yeah, very interesting. For me, when we think about public service, at least in Lithuania, I guess in Baltics as a whole, perhaps, um, public services tend to be quite skeptical about the dramatic changes, or introduction of technology, AI, etc. And even though now these days we have great examples of public service companies or ministry companies, in Lithuania government that are futuristic. They still lack of brave decisions, I think, or hesitant to take those brave decisions to move ahead with what they do on a regular basis, their processes that has been there for years. Staff obviously also hesitant about any change, which probably is united across the European Union in general. What was your challenges, and how did you manage to take those Slovenian, clients on board to make this change?
And firstly, my starting point is that ambivalence about technology. And I think the people who are skeptical and wary are absolutely correct, because they're running complex services. They work now, and there's lots of examples of technology kind of dropped in that doesn't work, doesn't understand the situation, isn't the right tool. And then it kind of can sometimes break the complex services that are already being delivered. So the starting point always has to be to work with people rather than on them. And this is the real problem with data, is that a lot of people don't kind of understand what data is. We all think we know what we're talking about when we talk about data. Oh, it's the numbers. But the origin of the word data is a given thing of this world. And so it's something naturally that's out there. And the word datum, the Latin, and this is the anthropologist Tim Ingold's definition of it. So anthropologists, you start by looking really carefully at nature. You know those beautiful drawings that Darwin did in the Galapagos? He spent hours looking at at nature, looking at his data was to observe. And for me, that's the starting point of all data stories, is not coming, hey, we got this data, and pushing it into a social situation. Rather, you spend a lot of time looking at the way the complex social relationships operate in an organization. And then you start co-developing practices of datification with the people who own that responsibility. So often data is, the tool theory, like a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So somebody with data walking around trying to deploy it. And much better for the data to be emergent from the situation. And so actually the numbers is the easy bit. We've way too much data in the world. It's how should it intervene in a social situation? And of course, the starting point of that is really a deep understanding of the social situation. And a lot of what government services do are very complicated. So it might be a technical thing that we think it's doing. So an unemployment service finding jobs for people. But the people who are actually working in those offices often think of it much more broadly. And they understand that the reason taxpayers are paying for this service is to help people find work. And that's kind of what they're about. But they're also, they do a lot of observation on the wellness of people. So they often refer people to other services for mental health service, domestic abuse, education, literacy, social inclusion. So there's a range of other things that are happening here. And if you're just kind of walking around kind of inserting data into this situation, it won't capture that. And that's why you'll get that resistance. So much better to work with people and co-develop data. And one of the things that also happens with data is that it flattens the world. And we lose context and the richness of situations. But of course, with big data and our the way we can use data now through computing and digitization, we can bring an awful lot more data to bear than in the 1950s when people had to write it all out on spreadsheets. So it's to use that complexity to get to something richer and not to be weighed down by it. So there's loads of challenges in producing kind of data-driven organizational development. And when it works, it is so powerful. But that comes from the right contextual intervention.
Nice. Yeah, and you mentioned, I guess, cooperation or buying into it is one of the key elements. But what are the key or basis elements that are needed for effective data strategy to be an organization?
Yeah, and I suppose co-development is often something we think we have to do to get it through, but we're still pushing with our hammer. And for it to be really authentic, nobody should ever use data without understanding it. Understanding how it's made, its strengths and weaknesses. And a lot of data infrastructures are hierarchical. So what goes up to the top of an organization is a single piece of data. So you may be running a complaints department and you get 80 calls a day. And each one is different and unusual and peculiar, and the complex social world that people live in is all present in those complaints. But when it gets to the top deck, it's often just that number. Well, you got more complaints today than yesterday, so we're not doing a good job. So thinning out and hierarchy of data is so it moves upwards in organization. And then the question is, how can we make it move downwards in this richer way? So it's much more than co-development. That really the owners of data production and data infrastructure have to be within the organization. And data can't be done to the organization. It has to flourish within the organization. That's almost a political question for how we manage. So Bruno Latour uses this phrase called the black box. And he argues that a lot of our data is in black boxes. And a black box it's like a computer. We don't know what's happening inside it. It just turns on, it works. And so we know what we put into it and we know what we get out of it. But you need to open the black box and see the mechanism and the blind spots, not just for biases and prejudices that might be in your data infrastructure, but opportunities. So one of the problems we have is this simplification of data, when in fact data should open a field. It should be so rich that it gives us a rich picture of the social world. And one of the things people privilege in data, which is wrong, is precision. And what we actually need to be able to deal with is impressionistic data. That is a mood, a vibe, an atmosphere. And to assemble multiple forms of data to give that rich picture. So for me, it's about pushing data understanding down the organization and making operationally orientated people within these large complex organizations masters of their own data fate, so that they produce their own data, they understand their own data, they can argue about their data. And as a result of that, the map of data, because data gives you this image of the world, and the terrain of the world where we live is always more complicated, and we need to simplify it to make the world manageable.
Yeah.
But producing lots of maps and knowing how those maps are produced, that's the central skill. So it's really about building capability within organizations to do their own data infrastructure work and stop being a consumer, become a producer, and then own the development process, so that it kind of unleashes the power of data within the organization.
Well, there's a lot of beauty within this, but I think we need to touch upon the devil as well of the side. Normally, at least for me, I would guess that most of your clients might have the exactly same goal. The aim for data usage is to actually have high efficient performing teams, and this is something that conflicts with the well-being a lot of times. And I hear your social responsibility or socially responsible attitude towards the data usage. But would you say that in general it is possible to keep that balance between high performance and happy team in very simple terms?
I think it is the challenge, and it's there to be fought for, because I suppose one of the crises we have in organization is the stress and workload. And a lot of that comes from data being done to people rather than done with people. So when data is done to you, you lose your agency over your own work and your freedom, and you become under the tyranny of the number that you have to perform to. And of course, that we know the power of that within organization in production environments particularly, So if you're working in a call center, the number of calls you take, the number of successful outcomes of those calls, all of that. And if you're working in a factory, and it's the number you're producing per shift. So these numbers are very valuable, but they also become totem poles in our lives. We become obsessed with them and reorientate ourselves towards them. So we do say when a number becomes a target, when a measure becomes a target, it stops having its potency. It stops being useful as a measure, because it becomes a political object within the world of work. So data also creates a mood or an atmosphere. And a lot of people don't think of that, but a lot of people have emotional responses to data. So, for example, if we hear about those recent floods in Valencia and the number of people who lost their lives, that can make us feel, we have an empathy with that piece of data, the number of it, and we think of ourselves in that situation. We think of our own lives and the people we care about. So, and that's why what I said in the last section is so important, that data needs to be handed back to the people with operational control, rather than it coming from outside and becoming a tyrant. It needs to come from within the organization. And if organizations develop their own measures of what they think is valuable, and not just one form of value, but because you know the way we use price as the sum of all values. So it's the measure, it flattens every object, and we can compare everything price to price. And even insurance companies compare the life of somebody's, against another. So measurement is very potent, and data drives that. But it can also go the other way, and it can lead to this flourishing. And that's all about it coming back to, so if you want to produce high performing teams, I think it's really important that the team's conversations at the start should be about setting their own data goals and making space for that conversation, not just to be a thin measure, but, a multiple measure of what does success look like. And to avoid that becoming a political action where it turns into a target that then gets used against people to drive their productivity, think of it as a scalular and what is a stretch goal to create space for people to be ambitious. Because if you ask me, would I run a marathon in 2 months' time? The answer will be no. But if you said, well, is there, 20% chance you would do that? Well, maybe I'm more interested. So to allow the tethering of accountability to measurement to be more complicated than 1 or 0, done or not done. And then also to think really about your values, because we have one of the key things that, say for example, I'm working with our local city on the walkability of our city. So cities have these complicated demands on them for transport, public transport, trucks coming in with goods and services, commuting trucks going through crossing the city to get somewhere else, and people walking through the city. And of course, to make that change, the kind of data you need for that is for the people involved in transport infrastructures to walk with people. So we've organised a series of walks where the designers of road junctions, they travel with children, with families, with older people, with disabled people, and they travel at night with women as well. So they go for a walk, like half an hour walk around the city, and that is the data that is informing the development of our physical infrastructure, rather than the speed of trucks or what other data is brought to bear. So when you sit down and you co-determine with people what is valuable and bring it all up to the surface of measurement rather than just one thing, I think that's how you get high performance teams. And the corollary of that is, how do you get poor performing teams? You project one measure onto them and say, do that. And then you have that feeling of working as a slave.
Is there any types of data or that organizations should prioritize when making this happening? Or is there any types of data that you see that normally we forget about, that are very important and should be looked at?
That's a great question. What isn't there in the data? And of course, we privilege numbers, and we privilege often single numbers that have a social acceptance as the number we should be looking at, like GDP, or the number of people unemployed, or the average commuting distance in a city or something. So we often privilege the one big number, and there's so much else we can't measure, and we should try and measure. And one of the things that I'm very passionate about is habilitating experiential data with statistical data. So, often we see a number, and when we actually pull that number apart, it often crumbles on us because it's made in a very silly way. Like it's quite a horrible example, but during COVID, we wanted to know the number of people who died because of COVID each day. And if you actually look at how we make that number, it's a really important number. If you look at how we make that number, we make it by doctors signing death certificates. And most doctors will prefer to sign the death certificate 25 hours after somebody has passed away because they want to be sure. And then also, how do you say somebody died with COVID, which is obviously inside them? You can't do a post-mortem on somebody with COVID because it's not safe for the doctors doing that post-mortem. So typically they leave the body for a number of days to make sure that the virus is dead as well as the person. So, and most people who died of COVID had many different diseases as well, a little bit of heart disease, a few other things going on. They were maybe older or something. So the purity of the data falls apart by too much close examination. So a lot of people don't like to do that kind of close examination. So it's so important to understand how data is made, because remember the flatten the curve graph and how we all stayed home because we were one graph that explained that we needed to reduce the replication of COVID. And in Ireland, we improvised two pieces of data to drive our social understanding. So really quickly, we realized we didn't have the data infrastructure to handle a pandemic. And the epidemiologists told us that we needed to drop social interaction by 83%. And that would stop the disease moving. And so really quickly they had to improvise. How do we do this? So they got two measures that were good proxies. One was the number of cars at traffic lights. So we have smart traffic lights, and most of our traffic lights measure the number of cars. So if they drop by 83%, we're doing it. And then the other was our credit card payments, because we know whether somebody's paid in person or whether they have rang in their numbers. And you could see that really quickly. So that shows how a supple, reactive, socially aware, contextual understanding of data infrastructure can really accomplish high quality decision making. And again, it's understanding your data really closely and what is not there. And the bit that I'm always trying to push to the front is the lived experience. You have to go and meet the people. So one of the things I discovered when I was developing computer systems for social welfare systems is that they've got like 15 minutes with a person, and that's a long meeting with a person. So if the computer system doesn't produce an answer within 5 seconds of a search query, it's dead to the user. And they're not going to fill in more than 3 or 4 boxes of information unless they have to. So you have to really make any computer interaction high value from a human-computer interaction perspective. And if you're going to make somebody wait, it has to be brilliant. What's at the end of this? The payout has to be big. So knowing the context, the situation, and who's not there, and particularly identifying marginalized people. So from digital infrastructure, how are young people who have low levels of literacy and are socially marginalized? How are older people who aren't very technically aware? There's all kinds of blind spots, and bringing them into the conversation is really difficult to do through data. So they're the real challenges.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, so we talked about high-performing teams. A lot of people are within that phrase, from various departments. And we mentioned a couple of times already well-being of the employees. We talked about how data can positively or negatively affect well-being, but we touched more about like a side effect. I'm wondering, can data actually be used to drive employees' well-being at the workplace, or work and life balance, at the workplace as a priority, so it's purposely built for that particular goal?
Yeah. Using the same methodologies I was outlining there, is in which you have honest conversations with within your workplace about what counts as valuable. So, when we think about employment quality, we think of wages and time flexibility often. But the symbolism of these kind of things can be more important. And there are other things that we can't really put into words, like, is it a good place to speak out? You know, if I have a problem, can I just say it to somebody and will something happen? Do you see people treated with respect even when they're treated badly? Um, is is um, is the workplace environment responsive to the desire to improve? So often you can be working in a bad place, like the situation isn't great, but everybody's trying to make it better, and that makes it good. So there's these hidden kind of measures that we don't know. So if you look, for example, at how we measure job quality. So there's the European survey of Silk, it's called, and that measures a bunch of these kind of things. So a good way of starting about that is you put that into a meeting and you show people this is what people think we should be measuring. What matters here? And develop your own measures. So a lot of organizations now are doing a kind of monthly 2-minute surveys with their whole staff. It's just a check-in on how are things. So we call them pulse surveys. And they're a way of, because if you're just listening to complaints, it might be the same people all the time, and it might be people who are really good at complaining. Whereas, and then you may say, well, we'll also look at retention. So if people leave, but just because people aren't leaving doesn't mean they're not happy or they're unhappy. Like a lot of people have to stay because it's close to where their children are in school or where their elderly parents live, or they've invested too much and it's too big a thing for them. So these pulse surveys are a really good method. And then the question is, what do you put into them? Because if that's the glasses by which you're looking at the wellness of your organization, those measures have to be really closely aligned to the way people are experiencing the organization. And so that's why I think you develop your own measures. And you can do this really quickly. People are really good at this, and there's some great off-the-shelf methods to do this with. And then do your own pulse surveys, and then feed them back, and then go back after a period of time and say, are we still looking at the right things? Is this, so like I'm getting a number of complaints about this, but broadly everybody's saying they're happy. So and it's not who is right or wrong. It's like, how do we go forward together? And so, and that's what I mean by co-developing, working with people, not on them. And when, making the data ownership kind of pluralistic around your organization. Because people are really conscious of surveillance, being measured, and we don't want to find ourselves trapped in these kind of prisons within our organization of surveillance and measurements, because they kill the spirit of the place and the ethos of the place, and they hurt your most passionate workers, the people who really care and feel that their caring and their work and effort isn't recognized through these measurement systems. And that's a double injury. It's one of the real challenges in contemporary workplaces. But we've so many good tools, and a lot of organizations, we've existing methods that we tend to just go with all the time, and it's worth looking at renewing this, especially as we've new generations of workers. So everybody's talking about like how the generations below myself, like I'm a Gen Z, but the generations below me have a different attitude. And I think it's really they're being asked the wrong questions, because the questions about my wellness are quite different for somebody who might be struggling with housing or struggling with childcare, struggling in a different situation in their life.
Yeah. You mentioned it all, I think, in terms of what I was going to ask you next, and you tapped on even on the further idea I had where we should go with our conversation, next. And this is our good old friend that joins us in our podcast. He is called GDPR, and all the ethical considerations, all the challenges behind collecting the data. I myself, I have a good example of brand new offices I was involved fairly recently, and those offices have a entrance key which is in the mobile phone. So you have to install the app, tap with your phone, you open the doors, and basically I would be brave to say 20-30% of the employees said they are refusing to use their mobile phones to enter the work office because they just want to have a card. They don't want to use the phones for any reason that it's work related, purely due to the, some threat potential, and also they just maybe don't feel that way in general. So how can we avoid these challenges? How can we avoid these ethical backlashes when we talk about a lot of data, about the data that it's created for the people, but at the same time, it might be perceived as a risk?
Absolutely. And I suppose the starting point is to recognize that all data has politics. And often the person developing the door system is just thinking about how it's going to work and isn't thinking about this politics, and then gets a nasty surprise when it encounters the world and people think, oh, well, somebody's going to come along and tie this to my payroll, and, and it'll have negative outcomes, and we need to resist this. And so those politics emerge really naturally because everybody is aware that technology has politics. And not just that, but it's also politics made durable. Because you can have your own employment relationship, but once this piece of surveillance technology is in there, nobody is any free ever to change it again. We're stuck with it. And there's lots of examples of these kind of technologies coming in and then everybody being stuck with the outcome of them. And I just think of your door closer example, which links back to a very famous story by Bruno Latour on the difference between a key and a doorman, so it's a really seminal kind of paper. But recently my organization had a cyber attack and we weren't able to get into our classrooms because they're all smart cards. So, often we don't think about this enough. And what was wrong with a key?
Yeah.
And one of the hidden things we know in my university is that having somebody coming around locking doors at night is so important for people's feeling of safety, because the university gets very, very quiet at night and sometimes people work really late and then they're walking to the car and they feel vulnerable because it's dark and it's winter in Ireland. And so there's these hidden benefits. So the politics of technology has to be there at the start. And of course, GDPR is not really a barrier to doing a lot of things. I know people use it as the defense.
Sometimes, yeah.
Yeah. But, and this comes from working with data. Working with people on their data. So I use this phrase, data reciprocity. Going back to when I was defining data, it's an observation on the world, but it's a given thing of the world. And that word to give, because we give our data to somebody. And if that isn't part of a circuitry of care, and if it's just taken from you and you never see it again, you don't know what it's done. So many times we fill out a form and on it there's a little box and we've put in our information and we're giving somebody, we don't know what they're doing with that. We don't know how it's being used. We don't know why. So it's so important at the start of all these data relations is to share what you're trying to achieve and to do it in a very transparent way that gives value back to the person giving their data. So, famously, I think at the start of social media, everybody was saying, if you don't have to pay for a service, you are the product. And, the way our search histories are then being sold by companies like Google or Facebook. And we don't know how that's being used. So, but we should be getting something back. And we're cut into the deal and we know what the deal is with most of those companies. And the same is true when you develop and improvise your own data systems in your organization, because we live in this era of confession where we have to explain ourselves in application forms and in data extraction methods, and this data is then taken from us and kind of like mined and we use these phrases like mining. And just think about mining. It's digging the earth, taking what we need. We don't give anything back to that earth. So I use that phrase data reciprocity, that it has to be a circuitry of gift giving and it has to be done transparently. And I think if it's done with that kind of spirit and trust, we can open up, because when we share our data, really good things can happen. So I don't know, on our mobile phones, for example, when we share all where we're standing in a city or where we're driving in a city, that data can be used to make the city work more effectively for a common good. But if we feel it's been taken from us and then being used to surveil us, and then we're not happy. So that reciprocity and the connectivity between give and take is so important to restore in data relations.
Yeah. Could not agree more. Talking about synergies and collaboration, I hear a lot from organizations that challenge is nowadays communication. Funny to hear this because we have all sorts of social media, chats, chatbots, chat engines, or whatever other chat tools we have. But we seem like we forget who we are, that we are humans, that we can talk, that we can collaborate between each other. Can data help us in such way, to learn again what it's like to be human and to work together with various mixed departments, communicate with mixed departments, create synergies internally?
Yeah, but it's a very big question. So I suppose I feel it can, because if we think of data as a given thing of this world, it is natural. And forced data, synthetic data, that's not natural. So if you go back to the origin of counting, so the origin of counting is the human hand and the sections here. So if you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you get to 12, and that used to be before we decimalized. So all counting was related to the physical world. So fishermen, when they would go out in their boats, they would bring a plate for every member of their family. And when there was a fish on each plate, they would have enough food and they would go home. So the origin was always tied to the natural and the social, and then we cut that and now end up in these very strange unnatural data. So for me, the answer is to go back to feeling that connection to the human experience in measurement and putting people back into measurement, returning the richness. And of course, we can do that with, take for example, Google Maps. Okay. The joy of Google Maps is I can zoom into the exact street you are in, and I can zoom all the way back to the planet. And this is something really new in data, because we used to only be able to deal with aggregate data that was cut from the street level. So I could look at a map of the world, or I could look at a map of the street, but I couldn't connect them, and my eye couldn't follow through that dimension of scaling up or down. And we can do that now with our data. And so, and that form, we use this word fidelity, which I love its origin because it comes from faithfulness. Like, is the data faithful to the people when it's aggregated? And to zoom down is the essential element of that. And I suppose the other challenge, so apart from scaling and offering richness and these kind of things that we can do with our data and do in our everyday life with our data, we have to recognize that we're in this very unusual time in which human attention has become very fragmented. And it's been happening for 100, 150 years from the first time people walked into cities, and just the sensory overload of skyscrapers, and now, of course, we've accelerated that with our phones, and nobody's ever bored anymore. Marshall McLuhan has this really nice idea that every technology is an extension and an amputation. So when we can do something new with technology, we always have to give something up. So we have a car, we can drive the whole country in a day, but we no longer know our neighborhood. And we no longer walk our neighborhood daily as we did during COVID, when we were all stuck in our own little bubbles and we rediscovered our neighborhoods. So every technological extension is an amputation. And then think of that in terms of data. So every time we have powerful data, what do we lose because we no longer can see something and we no longer pay attention to it? And when you talk about like how do we restore the idea of a good life and quality of life and good work and such things, the essence of that is putting people back into data and thinking. And I've said this a few times already, which is like who's missing and what's missing from your data, because what are the blind spots? So yeah, that's where I feel we can really make a positive social impact through data.
Fantastic. Another positive impact that companies are willing to make, in some discussions we can say even being forced to make, is sustainability approach, to everything we do in our operations, in our organization development, in growth, operations in general as a whole. Can data contribute to sustainability goal? Can it help to improve sustainability within the companies, both environmentally and operationally?
Absolutely. And using the techniques I've been talking about, which is, what we need to focus on is the ability of people to produce their own measures that they value. So economists use the word externalities to deal with, so like when you experience costs and things, it's in a boundary. And then external costs, which are diffused and you don't experience. So I don't know, when I buy an automobile, I'm giving the car company my money, but the external damage to the environment through mining or through its production or through fossil fuels or whatever isn't captured in that model. And because it's not captured in the data, it doesn't get measured and it doesn't get acted upon because it's somebody else's problem. And if sustainability matters to you, we have to drive new forms of datification. And I'll give you two really silly examples. In accounting systems, we use depreciation all the time. And so a piece of technology, like if my company bought this phone, in 3 years' time, it would be fully depreciated. And they would say it has no value. So on their accounts, and so their data double of my phone is that it's worthless. But it could be really worth, because phones last 5 or 6 years if you're careful. And so depreciation is a technique of measurement that says everything is eventually worth nothing. Everything you own in this company, it's like dying and is going to be destroyed. And of course, if you buy well on the first day, you may have a chair for 20 years. And if you care for things and look after them. So we produce a bunch of measures that legitimize destroying everything. And of course, if we want to become sustainable, we need to start acknowledging the value of repairing, of caring for things and fixing things and giving them total lives. But also, we need a new way of recognize when you buy something well and you have it, you could have it forever and it'll provide a value within the organization. The other accounting technique that we often use, which is net present value, which assumes an economic growth rate and it assumes an expanding economy. And of course, for us to mitigate the worst effects of climate change, we will need to get off being growth junkies. And we'll have to, learn how to produce a dematerialized economy, so less physical, less movement, less carbon-based economy, and we'll also have to just do less. But we've built a world entirely, and embedded in a lot of our measurement systems is this destructive, unsustainable mentality. Undoing that is a global level project, but of course we can start in our own organizations in very practical little ways.
I promised before our conversation that I will not put you on the spot, but I'm not sure now how do I feel about the next question. But I will still ask because I think you have that much experience that you'll definitely have something to share with us. Do you have any examples from your clients, from your own experience, where sustainable practices from data point of view has been introduced to the company, but it hasn't made that company to lose any money, or alternatively even allowed them to make even more money? So it was not a negative change in terms of economical company situation.
Yeah, so like I'll give you a very simple example, which is so we did a study on the digital exclusion of clients in social welfare offices. And we identified the different, because we think of digital exclusion as one word, but when you break it apart, it's different things. So it's some people don't have access to devices, some people don't have literacy, some people don't have confidence. So there's a range of different, and some people don't have they don't have somebody to help them, even if they're missing all those things. And so we talked with caseworkers about how should we go about addressing this. And we came up with loads of great technical solutions. But then we looked at the data analytics of these individuals, and it kind of showed that, okay, you can put a lot of resource into making these people do your digital performances, but in reality, their social challenges are much more related to social exclusion than finding a job. If the 15,000 people in Ireland who fall into this category, if you found them work, you wouldn't increase GDP. You wouldn't grow our economy. You wouldn't stabilize. You wouldn't address work shortages. But you could work towards that. But then the question is, why should you work towards that? Like, if the actual model isn't that they're all going to be working for Google in 10 years' time and making 150,000 euros a year. So we looked at them, and kind of through that casework, we talked about, well, is this a place where we can stabilize communities with degrowth initiatives? And rather than having, get somebody into a job, get them working as the outcome, we should be thinking in terms of a broader range of social inclusion measures. That what we really want is that those people to make a positive contribution in their community. Often they have complicated caring responsibilities with older members of family or young children, and sometimes they volunteer in sporting organizations, but they often live in very remote rural parts of the country. So through that mechanism, they came up with new measures of outcomes. And really, they just looked at the amount of money they were going to spend on this service, which is close to 100 million a year. So that's a huge social investment. They all knew it wasn't going to work. And even if it did work, it wouldn't accomplish the goals that they would want for the system. So it's like, can this insanity be held back? And on foot of that, they developed a new social inclusion program that took some of that resource and then thought about their values and what they were looking for in the context of a degrowth. And they're using it now as an experiment in what would post-work welfare systems look like. Because at the moment, Europe is a work cult in which everybody is working, and we've historically very, very high levels of employment, very low levels of unemployment. But we know we also have this sustainability challenge. So it's kind of a really good example about how working through the data infrastructure, because the targets that the system had set for itself were the wrong targets for this group, but they were still going to work towards them. So I think that's kind of a nice example. It wasn't particularly my interventions there. There's a huge number of policymakers involved in that. But it was interesting to see how the data interventions moved that world. They were the lever that made new things possible.
Fantastic. Well, I have to admit I'm having a great time, but I can see that we're nearly hitting 1 hour. So let's sum up what we've already talked, and maybe we'll have a couple of more additional ideas before we finish this podcast. So what are the common mistakes organizations do when they go for a data-driven solutions, and how to avoid them?
So I'll give 4 really quick points. Using thin data rather than the potential of rich, thick data. So one measurement when you have lots of different measurements and they give you a richer picture. Of course, technology allows us to do that now. Second thing is doing data to people rather than with people. So where data is projected on people and it becomes a surveillance or a disciplinary technology rather than something that allows flourishing. And then people become suspicious of all data and the way all of it works. The third is data reciprocity. So to make sure that instead of taking data from people and running away with it to use it for your purposes, you make sure it's given back to people to support their own growth and decision making and inform themselves. And even if that's not possible, you have a high standard of responsibility to explain why you're collecting it, and how it's going to be used and how that might produce a social good. And then the final thing, and probably the biggest thing, and we haven't really talked about it, is there's so much data just lying around there and it doesn't get used. And so we've collected it and we've gone through all the drama and trauma and people filling out forms and all this infrastructure we've built, and then we don't use it. And of course, when we do use data in positive ways, it can really change the world. It changes the atmosphere, the mood, the ethos, as well as the factual, logical world that we think it changes.
Fantastic. I think you just hit the bullseye, because we talked about sustainability, but how simple it is to stop using electricity on the new data when you can actually use the data that is already around you and make it work, and that will save costs on people, that will bring a lot of new colors, to your organization, and we will not have many ethical considerations, in terms of very advanced data, because that data is already here. So thank you, Ray. Thank you very much. I'm sure it has been a very entertaining, nearly 1 hour. So thank you for that. It's a long gig, but I think for those people that are a bit skeptical about the data, that thinks that technology, AI, all of those digital things surrounding us may ruin our well-being, may ruin our sustainability, may make us a little bit like robots, that we are being forced to do something, and we always have the argument why, because of a one or another number. I think your point of view gives completely different colors and really inspires to try something data-driven, even today. So thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thanks for this.
Fantastic. Yeah, and if you listen to this podcast and you enjoy what Ray said, if you caught some ideas that you actually need for your organization, then I highly encourage you to get in touch with geekeducation.com, and we will make it happen. We'll ask Ray to come over and actually show how does it work in practice. So thank you for your time today, and I'm really looking forward to the next time I'm seeing you. Thank you. Bye.
Ciao.